Lisa Fiore, President of the Board of Trustees for South County's oldest museum. And this year, we are celebrating our 134th year. Yay! And the museum's mission is education, and we know the importance of early education for young children from pre-K to 5th grade. Our talented education director and our vice president is Mary Cocorth Brown. She works hand in hand with our gifted fellow board members, and that would be Louise Weaver, Linda Hennessy, who's here tonight, Jean Rothstein, right on the queue, Betsy Cook, and our administrator, Julie Wardwell. Their workshops are creative, engaging, and informative. They also host OLLI groups, group tours of the museum gallery here, and walking tours of historic Peacedale Mill Village. Our wonderful evening speaker series is curated by fellow trustee Karen Ellsworth, and Karen also researches and writes our first-rate newsletters. Here at the museum, we strive to keep history alive, in particular, local history. We take great pride in our local and state heroes. Tonight's speaker is Professor Evan Wilson from the U.S. Naval War College in Newport. He holds degrees from Yale, Cambridge, and Oxford. And his areas of expertise are extensive, and they include maritime history and strategy, piracy, the Revolutionary War, and the War of 1812. Fortunate for us, Professor Wilson's expertise includes a South Kingstown native, Oliver Hazard Perry, born in 1785. So tonight's presentation is the life and times of Oliver Hazard Perry. Let's give a warm welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I hope to tell you something new about Oliver Hazard Perry, or maybe remind you of things that you already knew. And I'm sure I'll get stuff wrong too, and you can correct me in the questions. It'll be great. Okay, so let's start with revenge. The USS Revenge, which is not that, but probably looked like that, was a 71-foot-long schooner armed with 14 6-pound guns. She'd been built in New Orleans in 1806, and her small size and light armament made her most suited for coastal patrols. Normally, the commanding officer would be a master commandant, or equivalent to about a commander in the Navy today. But in January 1811, her captain was a 25-year-old lieutenant named Oliver Hazard Perry. He'd been in command since April 1809, so he knew the ship and her crew of about 50 very well. He also knew the waters in which Revenge was sailing. Revenge had spent the last 2 years rotating between service in New York, in Charleston, South Carolina, and in the triangle formed between Montauk, Nantucket, and Newport. Perry's most recent, you're all right, come on in, I don't bite. Okay, they can fill in, we got seats up here too. Perry's most recent orders had been to survey the entrance to Narragansett Bay to improve navigation in that area, but that was a difficult task to accomplish in the middle of the winter, so he'd run out of the time that his commanding officer, Commodore John Rogers, had allotted to him for the task. So on the night of January 8th, Perry decided to sail Revenge from Newport to New London, where Rogers was based, to ask for more time. The tide schedule meant that the best time to sail was at midnight, so Perry began moving Revenge out to Fort Wolcott on Goat Island that evening. Now, normally Perry would have ordered his executive officer, or in those days called a first lieutenant, to handle the overnight leg. On this night, though, that wasn't an option. His second in command was Acting Lieutenant Jacob Height, and he was probably drunk. Perry had placed Height in confinement, basically locked him in his cabin, until he could get to Rogers to figure out what to do with him. Come on in, it's all right, I'll pick up in a second, you're good? Thanks. So Perry turned instead to a pilot that he'd hired as his acting master named Peter Daggett, and asked him to handle the overnight duties. Now, both Perry and Daggett knew coastal Rhode Island very well. Perry, of course, was born here in South Kingstown, about which more to come. And Daggett was also a local. Both men had grown up sailing these waters. That made them confident that they could handle the tricky navigation on a winter's night with a high likelihood of fog in the morning. So Perry and Daggett decided to take the shortest course to New London, which was to steer between Fisher's Island and Watch Hill through what is known as the Race. First, that meant giving Point Judith a wide berth, so head out around Point Judith, And then Perry gave Daggett those orders and then went to sleep around 1 o'clock in the morning, trusting that Daggett knew what he was doing. At 9 a.m., the leadsman, the man responsible for dropping a lead-weighted line to check to see how much water was under the keel, called out 10 fathoms, which was just 60 feet. Perry, startled, came rushing out of his cabin onto the deck. The leadsman then called 5 fathoms, just 30 feet. Perry knew that meant trouble, so he immediately ordered the best anchor dropped. In the fog, it was hard to be certain, but Perry assumed that he was 8 to 10 miles east of Watch Hill Reef. In fact, as the leadsman's calls suggested, Revenge was on the reef. Worse, it was now high tide again. When Revenge struck the reef, therefore, the water level was going to get worse before it got better. Perry ordered the anchor cable cut to prevent the ship from swinging around and grounding even worse, but the swell pushed Revenge higher onto the reef. Now, Perry remained calm despite the danger. The fastest way to lighten the ship was to throw the guns overboard, so he gave that order. He released Jacob Height from confinement. I guess he'd probably drown if you left him in there. He sent a boat out with the second anchor to find deep water, which they did, but pulling on the anchor to get the ship off the reef didn't work. Next, he sent a midshipman ashore to get help from Commodore Rogers in New London. So he had to go ashore, ride to New London, and then ride back. And that meant that help arrived at 3 p.m., but the wind and the swell had come up in the meantime, preventing them from attaching a tow line. Next, Perry ordered the mast cut down to save weight, and the crew worked hard to do that and man the pumps. But then Revenge struck harder and began to flood too quickly for the pumps. So Perry gave the fateful order to abandon ship. At sunset on January 9th, 1811, Lieutenant Oliver Hazard Perry abandoned his first command as a wreck on Watch Hill Reef. There were no casualties, but the ship was a total loss. And so that's how the career of the great naval hero of South Kingstown, Rhode Island, came to a premature end, right? There's some gun that they've actually recovered from the wreck of the Revenge. And now, of course, Perry's career didn't end there, or else we wouldn't all be here, but it probably would have been true today. I'm a professor at the Naval War College in Newport, so I work closely with lots of naval officers. I'm a civilian myself, to be clear, and the views and opinions I express here tonight are my own and not necessarily those of the US government or the US Navy. But working closely with naval officers means that stories like this are common. Here's one from a while back about an officer being relieved of command for putting his $1.5 billion destroyer on a sandbar. No damage was done, but he probably won't get another ship to command. Now, Perry did get another ship to command, as you all undoubtedly know, but I thought it was worth beginning my talk tonight with the story of Revenge because its local connection and to illustrate how unlikely it was that Perry would become one of the great heroes of the War of 1812. So my plan this evening is these 5 sections, is to look first at Perry's family, about which I'm going to get a lot wrong, so you can tell me all the things I get wrong, and then provide some context for the War of 1812, and then tell the story of how Perry came to be famous. This lecture began life as part of the South Kingstown 300th anniversary series, and then I was asked to give it at Ollie at URI, and now I'm here in Peacedale, so I'm probably running out of audiences at this point. I'm sorry if you've heard this before, but in any case, I should emphasize I'm not an expert specifically in the Perrys or the Hazards of Rhode Island. I am a historian of the Age of Sail, as you heard. I wrote my doctoral dissertation on British naval officers of Perry's generation. I published books and articles on other aspects of Age of Sail history, so I'm going to try to give you a narrative of Perry's life. But if you already know a lot about Perry's life or the Hazards or whatever, it won't be new to you. If you don't know anything about Perry's life, that's great. I'm hoping that what I can do, regardless of what you already know about him, is to provide some broader context for his life, some of which you might not know. So with those caveats, let's get to it. Okay, family. Oliver Hazard Perry's ancestors were part of the great Puritan migration of the 1630s, but they soon left Massachusetts for the more congenial atmosphere of Rhode Island. They were Quakers. Benjamin Perry settled in South Kingstown in 1704. He and his descendants were farmers and minor government officials who raised Narragansett Pacer saddle horses. Benjamin's son, Freeman Perry, married Mercy Hazard, son of Oliver Hazard, a prominent planter. And I think that that's probably the common ancestor that these two have with Oliver Hazard. As you'll see, Oliver's line doesn't get very far, but that's my best guess. If you know more, tell me. That marriage was an important moment in the family's history because Freeman Perry was the last Quaker on his side of the tree. His wife's family, the Hazards, were not Quakers and not pacifists. They served in the local militias and in the colonial assembly. Freeman and Mercy's son, Christopher Raymond Perry, known as Raymond, was born in 1761, and he followed in his mother's family's footsteps. So he was a teenager when the Revolution began, so he enlisted in the militia and then in the Continental Army. But the key moment in his life came when he decided that being underpaid, underfed, and shot at in the Army was no fun, and that he should instead seek his fortune at sea. So he served in privateers, which are ships authorized by governments to attack enemy shipping. He was captured by the British and imprisoned in New York on a prison hulk, which is an old ship used as a prison. That is no fun. But he managed to escape and join the Continental Navy. Now in those days, it was common to move in and out of military service. So Raymond, just as he'd done with the Continental Army, then left the Continental Navy and joined another privateer. Here again, his luck ran out and he was captured again by the British. And this time they were like, we're not gonna make that mistake. They sent him all the way to Ireland. Said, you're gonna stay there. Now, Raymond never seems to have let setbacks keep him down. While in prison in Ireland, he fell in love with a girl named Sarah Alexander. I say girl deliberately, we'll get to that, who was the orphaned teenage ward of the prison commandant. Now, of course, he couldn't act on that love while he was still in prison. So for the second time in his life, Raymond escaped. To get out of Ireland, he impersonated a British sailor, sailed to the West Indies, and from there to Charleston, South Carolina. He was there when the war ended in 1783. So now trade between the newly founded United States and the former mother country rebounded really quickly. So Raymond decided to join a merchant ship sailing for Ireland. When the ship began her return voyage, Raymond was thrilled to learn, or probably he had arranged for this to be the case, that Sarah Alexander was on the passenger list along with her guardian, the former commandant. That man's name was James Calbraith, and he was traveling with his son, Matthew. So for those who know the Perry family tree, you'll see where this is headed. Raymond and Sarah were married. Sarah was just 16 when the ship landed in Philadelphia. They moved to South Kingstown. Is this the house? Yes. Hooray. Okay. Probably to this farm here on Route 1 to live with Raymond's father. And that's where Oliver Hazard Perry was born on August 23rd, 1785. Now, Oliver Hazard was followed by a brother named Raymond in 1789 and a sister named Sarah in 1791. So to recap then, Raymond and Sarah Perry had children named Raymond and Sarah. Real creative family. For the first 8 years of Oliver's life, the family lived on the farm in South Kingstown. So Oliver grew up surrounded by horses and agriculture, but not for long. Remember how chaotic his father's life had been up to that point. He was a twice imprisoned veteran of both the Army and the Navy, as well as several privateers. Now, while the details of Raymond the Elder's life in this period are a little sketchy, it's not surprising that in 1793, Sarah, Oliver's mother, decided to move the whole family to Newport. We can guess that Raymond was sailing on merchant ships out of Newport, and therefore it made more sense as a home for the family than rural South Kingstown. Sarah moved into a house in the Point at 2nd and Walnut Streets, so over here, owned by Nathan Hazard, so it's a sort of family deal. It was a typical 2-story gambrel-roofed house with a central chimney. There are lots of examples of houses like that still in the neighborhood. The family stayed there for 40 years. This is not the house on Washington Square. We'll get to that one later. This is the house in the Point. Okay, another reason to move to Newport was that it gave Oliver and his siblings better educational opportunities. No offense to South Kingstown, sorry. Sarah found a schoolmaster to teach them Greek, Latin, and math, which I guess were harder to come by over here. And in 1794, Matthew Calbraith Perry was born in Newport. And Sarah used that opportunity to get Matthew, Oliver, and all of the other children baptized in Trinity Church, the seat of the establishment in Newport. So long gone from the Quakers, and we're not Quakers anymore for sure. The family's move to Newport didn't change the basic pattern of the elder Raymond's life. He seems to have been frequently absent, captaining small trading ships. He was a respected figure in town, I think. He was the first Grand Master of the Masonic Lodge, so that sounds plausible, but he clearly wasn't great with money. So there are reports that Sarah Perry and her family were kind of on the fringes of Newport's high society. As a ship captain, Raymond was socially respectable, but that didn't always translate into like new sets of clean clothes for the kids. So that meant when the Adams administration decided to refound the US Navy in 1796, don't tell anyone, but the US Navy more or less ceased to exist there for a while, but I'll pass right over that. When the Adams administration decided to refound the US Navy in 1796 to deal with the British, French, and North African attacks on American commerce, Raymond saw an opportunity to get a steady salary by putting himself forward as a candidate for a commission. From just 59 total officers in the early 1790s, the US Navy grew to more than 700 by the end of the decade. Raymond was one of them, using his privateer and merchant service to get himself a commission at the second highest rank in the Navy, which was post captain. He supervised the construction of a 28-gun frigate being built at Bristol, the General Green. That is not the General Green, sorry, but she probably looked roughly like that, named after Rhode Island's own Nathaniel Greene. So we just heard about Nathaniel Greene recently. This is the ship named after him. Now, as an aside, it's worth noting that Secretary of the Navy Benjamin Stoddert specifically ordered Raymond Perry not to recruit any people of color in his crew. Always remember that this was an era of explicit white supremacy. But back to Raymond and his ship. Another of Raymond's recruits was his son, Oliver Hazard. To get Oliver nominated as a midshipman, Raymond had to write to the Secretary of the Navy and get congressional support from Rhode Island's delegation, who'd also helped him get his own commission. Now, given the demand for new officers in the Navy, Oliver had little trouble getting his midshipman's warrant, which was dated April 7th, 1799. He was 13 years old. Now, keep in mind, that was actually a typical age to send a young boy to sea. As I mentioned, I've written a book about British naval officers in this period, and 13 is almost exactly the average age for future British officers to become midshipmen. That's because of some particular requirements for sea time in the British system, but it also reflects the fact that a 13-year-old boy is just about old enough to go away from home for a long time. Think about boarding schools today. They're usually 14, 15, right? He can read and write, and he has a little bit of Greek and a little Latin and a little math. Now he needs the practical skills of a sailor. So what better time in your life to learn them when you're growing into your body? Of course, it helps that your father's your captain too, so you're not really that far from home. So in all these ways, Oliver Hazard Perry's path to the Navy was pretty typical. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on the next decade of Oliver's life, mainly because the key theme of that decade is like missed opportunities. There were 3 major deployments he took, and in each case, something went just a little bit wrong from Oliver's perspective that kept him from participating in famous events or from getting promoted at an early age. So deployment number 1, still not the General Greene, sorry, was on board the General Greene to the Caribbean, where Raymond Perry's orders were to protect American trade in the chaos of the Haitian Revolution. Could spend hours talking about the context of this deployment, but to reiterate, from Oliver's perspective, it wasn't as exciting as it might have been. The General Greene turned out to be a poor sailor, suggesting that Raymond may not have done a good job supervising her construction. Also, the crew got sick almost immediately after arriving off of Cuba, and Raymond decided to return to Narragansett Bay to offload those suffering from yellow fever and malaria. He returned to Haiti in the fall, and Oliver saw his first combat in support of Toussaint Louverture's attack on the town of Jacmel in February 1800. But Raymond was a difficult character. He fell out with his superiors and was relieved of his command in the aftermath. So much for following in his father's footsteps. Now, Oliver's career continued away from his father in 1802 when he joined the Adams. That's the Adams. Look at that. I found one. And sailed to the Mediterranean to deal with the Barbary states. Here again, Oliver saw some action, but it was limited, and the Adams was ordered back to the U.S. in 1803 before the great action of this period, which is the cutting out of the captured USS Philadelphia. As with the Haitian Revolution, we could spend a lot of time talking about the Barbary Wars, but they play a relatively minor role in Oliver's trajectory. He went to the Mediterranean again in 1804 on Constellation. This is a trick. That constellation is the 1853-54 constellation, not the 1797 constellation. So you learned something, see? But yes, that looks, they used to claim it was the constellation, but it is, I see some nods in the back, yes. The Navy lied about that for a long time. Not great. Anyways, he went to the Mediterranean on the actual original Constellation, transferred to Nautilus and then to Constitution, and then returned home in 1806. It's hauled the car like transatlantic multi-year deployments uneventful, but really that was the case. So more important than the deployments in this period were 2 people that Oliver met. The first was a fellow naval officer named James Lawrence, who was 4 years older than Perry. Lawrence was involved in a failed attack on Tripoli during Perry's first cruise in the Mediterranean. Perry was struck by Lawrence's aggression, and it formed the basis for an important friendship. We'll come back to him. The other person was Elizabeth Champlin Mason, whom Oliver met on his return from the Second Mediterranean deployment. As her middle name indicates, she was part of the socially elite Champlin family of Newport. That's probably her. It's a little hard to tell, but probably. The 2 fell in love in 1807. She was 16, he was 22. But her family refused to sanction the match. The Perrys simply weren't on the same social level as the Champlins, and nothing that Raymond had done in or out of naval service had changed that perception. So the couple had to wait. 1807 was also the year that Perry finally received his commission as a lieutenant. Now he was a full-fledged officer eligible to command ships. Instead of ships, though, he received gunboats. He spent 1808 between Westerly and New York, supervising these vessels that were supposed to be used for coastal defense in the event of a British attack. He worked closely with James Lawrence, deepening their friendship. In 1809, Perry received his first proper command, Revenge. Still not Revenge. I told you already how that story ends. It's worth noting that in 1809 and 1810, Perry took Revenge all the way to Spanish Florida to protect American trade and prevent Americans from causing diplomatic incidents that might bring the U.S. into the broader Napoleonic Wars, which more to come on that point in a second. But on that fateful winter's day in January 1811, Perry lost his first command, thanks in no small part to his own negligence. It's doubly ironic that he should wreck the ship where he did, since the nearest beach was one on which he'd played as a child, and the waters were the same waters in which he learned how to sail. Now, perhaps his knowledge of those waters made him overconfident, maybe he was just unlucky. The Navy didn't hold Perry responsible in the sense that the court of inquiry cleared him of any wrongdoing, so he was like officially cleared, right? But the Navy did hold Perry responsible in the sense that Perry was no longer on a career trajectory that would put him in a position to get a seagoing command if war ever broke out, right? They don't trust him anymore. There was every chance that his career was basically over, just like his father's. The Secretary of the Navy, Paul Hamilton, sent Perry back to gunboat duty, which was dull and unlikely to lead to glory. So 1811 must have been a very difficult year for Oliver Hazard professionally. The only silver lining was that the Champlains finally relented and allowed Elizabeth to marry Oliver in May 1811 after an engagement of 4 years. Given that nothing about Oliver's situation had changed for the better, and indeed, in many ways, the prospects had gotten worse, the best explanation is that the families recognized that their commitment to each other was not likely to be broken. They toured New England for their honeymoon, exotic New England, visiting Perry's ancestral home in Plymouth, so they went on a middle school field trip, basically. Then they moved in with Elizabeth's mother, and 11 months after their wedding, welcomed their first son, Christopher Grant Champlain Perry. 2 months later, the United States declared war on Britain. Suddenly, there was a chance that Perry's career might not be dead. Okay, excuse me for 1 second. Okay, thank you. The War of 1812 is one of the most misunderstood conflicts in American history, so I want to take a moment to provide some background. I'm going to do that in my capacity as a British naval historian because I think it's always important for American audiences to hear how the other side approached the war. The United States declared war on Britain on June 18th, 1812, after a close vote in Congress. Remember that? Wild. Anyways, 6 days later, Napoleon's army of about 500,000 men crossed the Niemen River into Russia, launching an invasion that changed the course of world history. Do you think it was obvious that one of these events mattered more than the other at the time? I do. Put yourselves in the shoes of British leaders in the summer of 1812. There's the Prime Minister, Lord Liverpool. I'm sure he has very comfortable shoes. You've just learned that you are now at war across an ocean against a minor power. That power cannot hurt you in any significant way. There's no chance of American troops landing in Wales or anything like that. Meanwhile, undefeated Napoleon is about to knock out the largest land power in Europe, giving him control of the continent from Madrid to Moscow. Right? Yikes. You've been fighting France on and off for more than 100 years, and intensely for the last 20. The war began in 1792, Britain joined it in 93, and there have been just one brief 18-month peace since then. Imagine a great power war lasting into its third decade. It's hard for me to do that, and I study them for a living. In 1812, Napoleon seemed to be reaching the zenith of his power. Nothing would have mattered more for the British than that. So why should we care about the British perspective? Well, for one thing, Britain was a great power in 1812, and the United States was not. So here's a side-by-side comparison of Britain and the US in 1812 across a few metrics to get a sense of their power. So Britain has more people, Britain has about 3 times our GDP, Britain has, I don't want to do math in public, many more times the number of soldiers and an infinite number more of ships of the line, right? So we've got a different metrics here. These are 2 different kinds of power. Now there are some people in Britain who wanted to fight the United States in 1812, but any sane observer and every important member of the British government thought it was insane to start a war across an ocean when there were far more serious issues to deal with in Europe. So before the British heard about the American declaration of war, remember that you declare war on somebody, it takes a while for them to find out about it, right? So it's about 6 weeks, it's 4 to 6 weeks, something like that. The British government rescinded the orders in council that had been one of the key causes of the war. So before they even knew we declared war, they're like, oh, we don't want to piss them off, so let's get rid of this orders in council. So what were the orders in council? They were British regulations that imposed on neutral shipping in the Napoleonic Wars, limiting their access to continental Europe unless they paid for a license, which was expensive. And since American shipping was neutral, American ship owners resented the orders in council. There was one reason why, so that's one possible cause of the war, and the British actually rescinded it before we before they found out that we declared war. So that was one reason why some in the US wanted to declare war. Another was an incident in 1807. So HMS Leopard had stopped USS Chesapeake off the coast of Norfolk, Virginia to look for British sailors on board. When Chesapeake refused to stop, Leopard chased her, fired on her, and boarded her, resulting in 4 American sailors killed and 17 wounded. This is in peacetime, this is in 1807. In almost any other context, it would have led to war, but President Jefferson, worried about Britain's significantly greater strength, remember he had that chart too, and decided instead to withdraw American commerce from the seas by getting Congress to pass the Embargo Act. It's basically the international relations equivalent of like taking your toys and going home so no one else can play with them, right? Unsurprisingly, that proved to be devastating to the US economy. Domestic exports fell from $49 million in 1807 to $9 million in 1808. Ouch. So 5 years later, there were plenty in the US who still wanted revenge for Chesapeake, which is fair enough. Another group in the US saw Britain distracted by the war in Europe and hoped to take this opportunity to invade lightly defended Canada. We've been thinking about invading Canada since we've been founded, by the way. We've tried several times too. Others simply wanted to push westward, and getting the British out of the region would help make that easier. So those were other reasons why the US declared war. The point is, there was no one reason why the US declared war. On the flip side, there was no good reason for the British to provoke it. They'd done that 5 years earlier. They already provoked it, but then they were like, oh, nope, we didn't mean it, pull back. In 1812, the last thing the British needed was another war. So from a global perspective, this was a sideshow, a distraction, and probably a war that would help Napoleon maintain control of Europe. The British could not and did not turn the full might of their military and naval power on the United States in 1812. Here's instead where the British forces were. I know it's an eye chart, but I'll walk you through it. So this is the Navy. In 1811, where's the British Navy? Well, 32% of the British Navy is in home waters. So this is off the coast of France, in the Channel and in the North Sea. 26% of the British Navy is in the Mediterranean, 11% is in the Baltic, 9% is in the East Indies, 9% is doing some convoy duty. Just 13% of the British Navy is anywhere near the United States of America, and that includes, by the way, South America and the West Indies. So they got 13% over there. How about the Army? Where's the Army? The Army is 30% of it's at home, 15% in the Med, 27% is in Spain fighting the French and Spanish, fighting with the Spanish against the French there. 12% is in the East Indies, 3% is in random other colonies, just 13% of the British Army is anywhere near North America, the West Indies. So a tiny percentage of British strength is deployed against the United States. So the best case from the British perspective was that the US would realize, now that the orders in council were rescinded, that there was no reason to fight. So the British Admiralty ordered its officers to wait and see if there was any chance of peace. As we'll see in a minute, there wasn't. But if there had to be a war, the next best case for the British was that they could fight it with the forces they already had in Canada. They had to admit, however, that given that most British troops were in Spain and not in Canada, it seemed likely that Canada was a lost cause. So that was going to have to be okay, though, because again, nothing mattered more than the European theater against Napoleon. They will concede Canada if it means defeating Napoleon. Now, as is so often the case in the war, it did not go according to anybody's plan. By the end of the year, the US Navy was making the Madison administration look brilliant for having taken on the vaunted Royal Navy. So on August 19th, USS Constitution used her superior firepower to capture HMS Guerriere. On October 25th, USS United States used her superior firepower to capture HMS Macedonian and tow her into Newport Harbor. On December 29th, USS Constitution captured and later burned HMS Java. Those were the 3 major victories, and they shocked the world. The 3 American captains, Isaac Hull, Stephen Decatur, and William Bainbridge, became 3 of the most famous men in the country. Can you imagine how Oliver Hazard Perry must have felt when he heard about these victories, or indeed saw a Macedonian being towed into Newport? Like the pride in the Navy, but also like the jealousy. These were his peers, the men he'd served with. He knew Bainbridge and Hull in the Mediterranean, and Decatur's father had lived in Newport. So can you imagine how desperate Perry must have been to do what they'd done, or at least join the fight? So the great frigate victories meant that by far the most desirable command for someone in Perry's situation was a brig sailing on the eastern seaboard. Perry thought that even though he was on the outs and pretty far down the seniority list, there was a chance he'd be given command of the brig USS Argus. Hey, look, Argus. That's good. Instead, though, the command went to the victorious first lieutenant of the United States, of USS United States, Perry's friend William Allen. Right? He won a great battle, so they gave him a promotion and gave him the command. So another blow to Perry, more jealousy. What could Perry do? The answer lay far to the west, where the war was not going so well for the United States. It turned out that Canada was not, in fact, ripe for the picking, and we're shocked. While the US Navy was winning great victories at sea, the US Army was busy surrendering Detroit. and with it all of Michigan territory. So in the winter of 1812-13, Perry made a point of offering himself for service on the Great Lakes. It was going to be difficult work fighting against steep odds in harsh conditions, but given that the war was going poorly, there was at least a chance of a proper fighting command. So on February 9th, 1813, he got the good news that Isaac Chauncey, they all look the same, honestly, but you know, but we can all pretend that's Isaac Chauncey, who knows, who was the senior naval officer in command on the lakes, had asked for his services. His job was to supervise the construction of a fleet on Lake Erie and then use that fleet to win the command of the lake. Okay, so let's take a step back here with Perry poised to head west to survey the Great Lakes Theater. Don't worry, you're not supposed to be able to read it, but you know, those are the Great Lakes. This is what West Point draws up for people to use. It's very helpful, actually. It's important to remember that the border between British Canada and the United States was the only place where British and American land forces could easily meet each other. That meant that while the naval war in the Atlantic was one primary theater, this was the other. It was also, though, a maritime theater, not only because the border was literally water, but because water was the fastest way to move in the region. So there were very few roads and settlements. What roads did exist were in poor condition. So any forces from either side needed to make sure that they had control of the lakes before they could go anywhere. Otherwise, the side in control of the lakes would be able to strike at their rear, interdict their logistics, and control the key choke points like Lake Champlain, up here, Niagara, here, and Detroit, right? The geography of the lakes also meant that you couldn't sail big ships from the Atlantic into the region. You could get to Montreal in a frigate, barely, but after that, any vessels on the lakes had to be built on the lakes. So Perry's job was to travel to Erie, Pennsylvania, there, and to supervise the construction that was already underway of a squadron of ships. Then he had to find men to sail and fight the ships, and then he had to use those ships to win control of Lake Erie from the British, who were busy building their own squadron to prevent this from happening. So a very similar story was playing out with Chauncey on Lake Ontario. So how do you travel from Providence, Rhode Island to Erie, Pennsylvania in February 1813? You walk. To help with the manning problem, remember very few people lived on the shores of Lake Erie in 1812. Perry took 140 fellow Rhode Islanders with him, including his first cousin, Stephen Champlin, and one of his younger brothers, Alexander. Of his men, somewhere between 15 and 25% were black or Native American. Notice the contrast with his father's recruitment orders. We're going to get to the reason we remember Oliver Hazard Perry here in a minute, but before we do, it's important also to recognize that he was by no means the only Rhode Islander in his squadron. Indeed, most of his squadron were Rhodey's. Now, all those assigned to the expedition traveled to Providence to begin the journey. They traveled by road to Hartford and then on to Albany before following the modern route of Interstate 90 across to Buffalo and then down to Erie. Along the way, Perry stopped to receive his orders from Chauncey on Lake Ontario. So when he arrived at Erie on March 26th, there was good news and bad news. The good news was that one of his predecessor officers on the lake, Lieutenant Jesse Duncan Elliott, had managed to capture one of the small British brigs on the lake called Caledonia and burn another one called the Detroit, which had formerly belonged to the US Army. So that had tilted the balance on Erie just barely in favor of the Americans, but there was still lots of building that needed to be done. And that was the bad news. Perry had no say in the choice of Erie as the US base. So Elliott, Chauncey, and others involved on Erie hadn't been impressed with the choices for a shipbuilding harbor, but eventually they sort of had to settle on Erie. Erie had no defenses already built, so Perry had to build them. Also, while the harbor at Erie was safe, it was probably too safe. I don't know if you've ever been to Erie, but there's this weird peninsula called Presque Isle that juts out into the lake, and it circles back almost all the way around. You can see this gap right here. It circles almost all the way back around. So this is the harbor of Erie, right? The channel through which the new ships would have to enter the lake right there, all the naval officers agreed was too narrow and too shallow. So Perry was in danger of building a fleet that would never even be able to sail onto the lake. Not great. But again, all those decisions had been made before Perry arrived, so he had to make the best with what he had. He looked everywhere for supplies. Erie didn't have much, about maybe 90 or 100 houses at the time, with very few naval stores like cordage and canvas, right? Ships are complicated. There was a good connection to Pittsburgh that helped, where you can get some guns, but that was tough going. One observer who visited Erie about this time later described how impressed he was by Perry's efforts. He marveled at Perry working hard at, quote, fitting out a fleet of 6 new vessels of war at some hundreds of miles from the seacoast and in a district where, except the green timber growing in the woods, not a single article necessary for the equipment of a vessel could be obtained that was not subject to a long transportation of some 120 to 400 miles through roads nearly impassable. The point is, it was really hard, building a fleet in the wilderness, right? The other problem was finding sailors to sail the fleet, assuming it could get over the bar. So if you assume you can get out, you need to be able to do something with it. Chauncey wanted to keep sailors on Ontario, where he was still locked in a struggle with British forces. Chauncey's idea was basically to win superiority on Ontario, then travel to Erie to command Perry's squadron, then roll up British forces at Detroit and on to Lake Huron. But Chauncey never achieved superiority on Ontario, and the Secretary of the Navy refused to take men from Atlantic frigates, which were famous, but currently blockaded by the British. They don't usually tell you that part, right? And send them west. So Perry ended up relying on volunteer Pennsylvania militiamen to fill out his ship's complements. Brave guys, but don't know how to sail a ship. Now, it's important not to pin too much blame for Perry's manning troubles on Chauncey, though, because on April 27th, Chauncey conducted an important raid on York, which is now Toronto, that destroyed a lot of the supplies that the British commander on Erie, Commander Robert Barclay, depended on to build his own squadron. Also, Perry worked with the Army to conduct a raid on the Niagara frontier, which cut the British supply line from Ontario to Erie on May 27th. So that meant that by the time his ships were ready to try to clear the bar, he and Chauncey had done a good job of isolating Barclay's squadron on Erie. Now, what Barclay should have done, and I can say this because Perry thought the same thing, was monitor American building efforts so that the minute that Perry tried to get his squadron over the bar at Presque Isle in Erie, he could attack. To get a ship over the bar, you had to take out all her guns, all her ammunition, and the crew had to be taken out. Then the ship had to be lifted on these Dutch-style camels, which are basically floating boxes, using oars, and then towed over the bar by dropping an anchor on the other side. Only then could the ship be reloaded, remanned, and rearmed. So initially, it seems, Barclay realized this vulnerability, so he maintained a blockade of Erie from mid-June to mid-July, to the end of July. But on the last day of July, he returned to his base across the lake to resupply. Perry worried it was a trap, but he thought he could get his largest ship, named Lawrence, over the bar. The first attempt failed, but by the second, they got it done on August 3rd. So Barclay showed up on August 4th, but he couldn't tell from a distance that just one of the American ships was over the bar. He thought the whole squadron was. Had he attacked then, Perry would have been in real trouble. But Barclay didn't, which meant that Perry's squadron, undermanned but at least as strong as the British, made it into the lake. Now the question was, who would win battle for control of the lake? Okay, let me take a break. Now, before we get to the battle, you'll have noticed the name of Perry's flagship. The Lawrence was named for Perry's good friend, James Lawrence, I promise, who had recently taken his frigate Chesapeake into action with HMS Shannon just outside of Boston. Lawrence had disobeyed orders to fight what basically amounted to a duel. The orders were, don't go out and fight the British outside of Boston. Lawrence said, screw it, I'm doing it anyways, all in the hopes of repeating the success of Constitution in the United States from earlier in the war. Lawrence made a poor choice. Shannon's captain, Philip Brooke, was one of the most innovative in the Royal Navy, and his crew was highly trained. That was not true of Lawrence's ship. Shannon made quick work of Chesapeake, disabling her in about 15 minutes. Lawrence was mortally wounded. As he was being carried below, he said, "Don't give up the ship." His crew did. Chesapeake was captured by the British and turned into a mall. I'm serious. You can go visit it today in Wickham, and the timbers there are from USS Chesapeake, then renamed HMS Chesapeake, then turned into a mall. Wait till we find out what happened to USS President. There's a whole other story here. We can get to that in the Q&A. But yeah, so the British turned it into a mall. Great. But in June, hearing about Lawrence's death, Perry decided to ask some seamstresses in Erie to make him a special flag. The day of the battle, on September 10th, 1813, when Perry had tracked Barclay's squadron down on the western end of the lake, Perry unveiled the flag to the crew. I'm sorry about the quality of this picture, but this is the original that's in the Naval Academy. He's reported to have said, "My brave lads, this flag contains the last words of the brave Captain Lawrence. Shall I hoist it?" "Aye, aye, sir," they replied, and gave 3 cheers. Great. He told them that the flag should not be hauled down again. Remember that. A cheer rose along the American line as the other ships in the squadron saw it. So let's keep this flag in the back of our minds. I skipped over lots of details about how the British and American squadrons came to face each other near Put-in Bay on the western end of the lake. But the key thing to understand, though, can be found in the balance of forces. Okay, here's another chart. Okay, so for the British side, there are 3 ships and brigs, which are the bigger ships, 3 smaller sloops or gunboats. They collectively have 33 long guns, 31 carronades, and can throw 496 pounds of metal at about the speed of sound. Okay, what is a long gun? A long gun, you might suspect, is good at shooting a small projectile a long way with some accuracy. A carronade is basically a shotgun. It's a short, fat thing that throws a heavy ball a short distance, not very accurately. Look at the American side. The Americans have 6 more small ships, a lot fewer long guns. Notice the 33 to 15, but they have more carronades and they're heavier. They've got about twice the broadside weight, meaning they can throw a lot more metal. Now they can't throw it very far, and they can't throw it very accurately, but they can throw a lot of metal if they can get into position. So tactically, the goal for Perry was to get as close to the British as he could, while the British wanted to keep the Americans as far away as possible. So the question was, which would be more successful in achieving their goals? Perry was impatient, and he nearly blew his chance. Not only did he begin the battle by tacking back and forth, here you can see, into the wind, unlikely to catch up to Barclay, but when the wind shifted to give him the advantage, his squadron became strung out. It was always difficult to stay together in the age of sail, since every ship handled a given wind in a slightly different way, and every ship sailed at a slightly different speed. But even if there were good reasons for it, Perry's squadron was dangerously exposed when the shooting began at 11:45 a.m. 4 British ships were able to concentrate fire on his flagship, Lawrence. So here's Perry and Lawrence. This is not to scale. The ships behind him are sort of strung out. The British are able to put Chippewa, Detroit, Queen Charlotte, and even General Hunter are able to fire on Lawrence. The other big ship in the American squadron, which is Niagara, here this is, was commanded by Jesse Duncan Elliott, couldn't, or perhaps didn't, get close enough to support Lawrence. They're a little unclear about that. After suffering incredible damage for almost 3 hours, all the guns on board Lawrence were knocked out of action. Blood ran across the deck, casualties were carried below. It was by all accounts a defeated and shattered ship. On board Niagara, back here, so this is Perry, this is Jesse Duncan Elliott, Lieutenant Elliott watched but took no action. He didn't come to Perry's rescue. Now what he should have done was order Niagara forward, either to break the British line behind Queen Charlotte, so here, or at least to support Lawrence. Only once he thought Perry must have been killed on Lawrence did Elliott begin to move his ship forward, and at that moment, Perry decided to give up his ship. Now, he didn't technically surrender. Instead, he hauled down the "Don't Give Up the Ship" flag and got into a rowboat to row over to Niagara. Let me repeat that. He took down the flag. He said, "I'm not going to give up." He didn't technically surrender the ship, but he got out of the ship and he rowed over Niagara in the middle of the battle. And then he took command of Niagara from Elliott. Back on Lawrence, the officers who were still alive decided to surrender her after Perry left. By the way, otherwise known as giving up the ship. So again, the officers gave up the ship, causing the British to cheer on the assumption that the battle was over. Instead, though, by 2:40 p.m., Perry had maneuvered Niagara, so there's Perry now in Niagara, towards the head of the American column and was aiming for the bow of Detroit, right? He's trying to cut off Detroit right there, which is Barclay's flagship. And at this point, Barclay suffered a wound and had to go below. His second in command, Lieutenant George Inglis, tried to wear the ship to prevent Perry from raking her. So he tried to turn it this way, to turn it away from the wind to prevent Perry from raking her, but that caused her to collide with the other large British ship, Queen Charlotte, at about 3 p.m. And now the American gunboats finally came up while Niagara poured carronade fire into the tangled British ships. The British soon surrendered the entire squadron, and the battle was over. So Perry had won a famous victory, thanks in large part to British incompetence, but nevertheless, you win, you win. And now the US had control of Lake Erie. It had been an extraordinarily bloody day. Elliott went on board Detroit to accept the British surrender, but slipped on the bloody deck before he could do so. And Perry thought that Elliott had been wounded when next he saw him because of all the blood all over his uniform. The total casualties were 27 American killed, 41 British killed, and 189 wounded. That means roughly a quarter of the participants in every ship were either killed or wounded. Amid all the cleanup and the mourning and the chaos and the aftermath, Perry found the back of an old envelope and wrote a now famous note to General William Henry Harrison, commanding U.S. Army forces poised to take advantage of the Navy's command of the lake. This is not the original, but it's the best I could do. Dear General, we have met the enemy and they are ours. 2 ships, 2 brigs, 1 schooner, and 1 sloop. Yours with great respect and esteem, O.H. Perry. Now, I should pause here for a second and just point out that as someone who cares about grammar, I get very frustrated when people cut the quote at the colon. We have met the enemy and they are ours. That makes no sense. The colon explains that we captured 2 ships, 2 brigs. This is the enemy that we actually captured, right? But you'll see the quote, we met the enemy and they are art. Well, what did you, all of them? Some of them? That's what Harrison wants to know. Perry knows that, so he tells him, but they cut this at this one. So anyways, sorry, that grinds my gears. Okay, so Perry's won the great battle. Why do we care about this? Well, here is the Congressional Gold Medal that was struck in Perry's honor. What had Perry accomplished? Why did it matter then? Why does it matter now? For the last part of the talk, I'm relying on research I did for my latest book a couple years ago now, which looks at the end of the Napoleonic Wars from the British perspective. You might check it out if you're interested. In the War of 1812, command of Lake Erie enabled Perry and Harrison to recapture Detroit from the British and defeat Tecumseh's Confederation. That meant that by the end of 1813, the war entered a precarious stalemate. On the eastern seaboard, by the way, you know the Army drew this when they draw a blockade by just putting dotted lines in the middle of the ocean. That's not how that works. But anyways, on the eastern seaboard, you basically got the American frigates have been so successful, we're now bottled up by the arrival of superior British forces. Remember what happened at Chesapeake under Lawrence. American privateers, however, were having lots of success preying on British merchant shipping as far away as the Irish Sea. That put pressure on London to win the war. But Perry and Harrison's victories meant that the British had no hope in attacking in the Erie or Huron regions because Perry had won here. So they had to look downriver to the east. So the governor of Canada began preparing an attack in that region in the winter of 1813-14 up here. So in other words, Perry's victory secured Ohio and Michigan for the United States and shifted the point of the next British attack to the east and to other theaters, as we'll see. Now, back in Europe, Perry's victory didn't matter, but Napoleon's retreat from Moscow sure did. The sudden collapse in Napoleon's power across 1813, culminating in the defeat at the Battle of the Nations in October 1813 near Leipzig, meant that there seemed to be a chance to remove him from power in early 1814. In March 1814, a Russian army of more than 100,000 men, led by the Tsar himself, marched into Paris. There's a crazy image for you, 100,000 Russians in Paris. Right? Napoleon abdicated the next month. That freed up British forces to focus on the US, finally. Imagine what that must have looked like for the Madison administration. You've successfully fought the British to a draw. You won on the lakes, but you're kind of bottled up in the Atlantic. But they haven't been paying attention, right? What's going to happen when they start trying? So the British attacked on 3 fronts. In the north, as mentioned, they attacked up here, but that stalled out in July 1814, thanks, shockingly, to the US Army, which was beginning to atone for its earlier mistakes. Second, in the Chesapeake here, this is the second major campaign, the British burned the White House, famously, but were turned back at Baltimore, the origin of the Star-Spangled Banner. Perry actually participated in the defense of the Potomac and the Chesapeake on land, commanding shore batteries because the ship that he was due to command hadn't yet been built, but he didn't see much significant action. And then third, in the south, the British launched an amphibious assault from the Caribbean that Andrew Jackson defeated at New Orleans. So the Prime Minister looked at the state of the war in the fall of 1814 and offered the Duke of Wellington, the most famous soldier in Britain, command of all the forces in British North America. Right now that Napoleon had abdicated, what do you want, Duke? Wellington told him that without command of the Great Lakes, there was nothing he could do. In other words, one of the greatest soldiers of his age saw the significance of Perry's victory. After Wellington refused the command, Liverpool told his ministers to negotiate an end to the war. They did around Christmas 1814, and by February and March 1815, the war ended with a return to the status quo antebellum. In other words, nothing had changed. Perry's victory contributed to the stalemate, which is about as good an outcome as the US could have reasonably expected. Now, from the British perspective, the War of 1812 was a giant distraction and waste of lives and resources. But from the American perspective, it was a second war of independence. By not losing, the US won. To be clear, however, the US did not win. If the British had wanted to keep going, there was nothing the US could have done to match their resources, but the British did not want to keep going, as we'll see in a second. The point is that even though the war that had not started as a second war of independence, it assumed them once the stalemate set in. That meant that Perry became a national hero, just as Nathaniel Greene had been before him. He'd won an important victory in a war that solidified US nationhood. That victory came after a summer of setbacks, including Lawrence's death. That's why he mattered then, and that's why we remember him today. Now, I mentioned that if the British had wanted to press harder, they could have. Well, that's sort of true. In fact, there was no appetite for continuing the war against the US among the British tax-paying public. Napoleon was defeated. He's the big bad, right? What's the point of fighting a war across an ocean? Britain was broke and exhausted from 23 years of combat. It was time to pay down the debt, cut back the Army and Navy, and enjoy the fruits of peace. This is debt to GDP in Britain from 1700 to the present. And you'll notice that in 1815, the debt to GDP ratio was worse than in the First World War and approaching that of the Second World War. These are massive wars. Here's what the debt looked like. If you were Liverpool in 1815, here's what you saw the debt had done. You're right? Liverpool doesn't know this story, but he knows this one. Yikes, what are we going to do, right? So the answer is you're going to cut. So the British budget cuts left a massive power vacuum. This is the percent of the budget. This is how much money the British spent on on defense in 2018 pounds, about 5 billion at the point of Waterloo, and they cut it all the way back down to this. That's a haircut. That's a proper defense cut, right? The irony is that it left a massive power vacuum around the world wherever British naval forces have been deployed, and nowhere was that more obvious than in the Caribbean. So you may remember that while all these wars were going on, the entire continent of South America, as well as Central America, was undergoing its own revolutions against Spanish and Portuguese imperial rule. So these are the dates of independence of all of South America, and you can see that they're all happening at the same time that I'm talking about here. So while the war ended in Europe after Waterloo and in the US after New Orleans, it was still raging in South America. Newly founded states like Venezuela were commissioning privateers to prey on Spanish shipping, and often they captured British or American ships as well. But the Royal Navy had gone home in the years after 1815, leaving international commerce to fend for itself. Remember, the British were very, very broke. So since the British weren't on the job anymore, the US had to take matters into its own hands. So in 1819, Perry was given command of a squadron tasked with sorting out all these pirates, privateers, and other threats to American shipping in the Caribbean and South America. His orders were to go to Argentina, but he never made it that far. While negotiating with the Venezuelans, he contracted yellow fever and died on his birthday in 1819, aged 34. So that cut short Perry's promising post-war career, but his legacy continued, of course, with dozens of places named after him. Many, I heard about somebody who went to Oliver Hazard Perry Middle School, right? Many monuments erected in his honor, including one in Washington Square, where he and his wife had bought a house in early 1819. So Oliver barely lived in the house that you see the statue of in Newport. And then there were their ships, at least 6 US naval ships, including the lead ship of a class, that's his tomb in the Farewell Street Cemetery. This is the class of guided missile frigates named after him, the Oliver Hazard Perry class. But I want to focus instead in terms of his legacy on the flag, because Perry's death by yellow fever is kind of anticlimactic and it's a real bummer from a biographer's point of view and tragic from a normal person's point of view. So I'm going to try to lighten the mood here a little bit. So the flag provides a little bit of a silly note. So let's look at the flag, a replica of which hangs today in the Naval Academy, and you'll see it all over the place. I was just with some students. One of them had a luggage tag that said, "Don't give up the ship." So it's, everybody's got this stuff, right? Okay, this is a previous Chief of Naval Operations, previous Secretary of the Navy, previous Chief of Naval Operations doing a change of command ceremony. The highest ranking officer in the US Navy doing a change of command ceremony directly underneath the replica, "Don't give up the ship," which hangs in Memorial Hall at the Naval Academy, right? Now, to be clear, James Lawrence disobeyed orders and then, after uttering those words, gave up his ship. Then Perry flew the flag, said it should never be taken down, took it down, gave up his ship, but still won a great victory. There's at least 2 levels of irony embedded in one flag. I wonder how many midshipmen actually know that story when they see the flag. Well, now you do. Thanks for your time. Happy to take questions. Sir?
Yes, I always read in history that part of the reason for the war is that British were conscripting men off ships.
Yeah.
And you hadn't mentioned that.
That's the Chesapeake Leopard affair. So it's called impressment. Let's start with this question. How do you tell if someone's an American in the 1780s? There's no social security number, there's no passport, right? So it's really hard to tell who's British, who's American. We just fought a war to divide from them. Nobody's old enough to matter who's born yet, right? So questions of nationality are really tricky. And the British insist that anyone who was serving on a Royal Navy ship and has left ought to come back because they're a deserter and they need to come back on. So they would board ships and look for British sailors And sometimes they boarded American ships where they thought there were a lot of British sailors, with pretty good reason to think that there were a lot of British sailors who were currently in American service. And that's what Leopard was doing to Chesapeake. So there is plenty of that happening, and that's one of the reasons to go to war, is to get back at the British for that. But it's only one of several reasons, and we're still debating as historians how many people actually got pressed back into the British Navy that way. But whatever the number is, it sort of doesn't matter, because the point is that they thought it was a lot and they cared about it. And so yeah, that was one of the reasons for the war.
When did you say he died?
1819.
1819?
Yeah.
So he didn't live very long.
No, 34. Sir?
Do we know where in South Kingstown he lived or he was born?
Yeah,
I saw the
off Route 1.
house.
Yes, I Googled it. I was told that the people who live in it might come, but I'm sorry, I guess they're not here. But can anyone describe it more accurately than somewhere off Route 1 for me?
Off of Route 1.
Yeah, that's what I read.
My cousin and I, back in the early 70s, his father had a lake to take care of the grounds. With a different family only.
So you can ask him for directions then.
So right off of Route 1 where?
On the right, if you come off of Hard Post Road.
Wait a minute, I got two.
It's all private property now. It's right after Condon Drive, I think is the name of the road.
It's kind of long, I
Right
mean,
after that.
but it's a
And
driveway.
Jerry Brown Farm.
It's a driveway. It's not-
Yeah, it goes into the woods about a
Yeah.
quarter
It's
mile.
off southbound lane on the right-hand side, right? You know where, Post Road, the part of Post Road, Camp Fuller goes off of? It's just about across the highway from that.
Oh, okay.
There's a driveway, and it's two driveways south of the convent.
Right.
Yeah.
And then I know where the house in Newport was, it's 2nd and Walnut, and then there's the house on Washington Square. So those are the three major Perry homes that are still, well, I guess the one on 2nd and Walnut I don't think exists anymore, but 2nd and Walnut Street still exists, obviously.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Ma'am.
Thank you for this very informative lecture. The graphic you gave, giving the, before the Lake Erie, the battle, you had the inventory of the British and the American ships of the line, how many of the short guns and long guns, yeah. That was this understood and known by each?
Yeah.
And does that mean there was intelligence that was going on that?
Yep. So they had pretty good intelligence on both sides of the lake from people who were able to observe what they were doing. Guns are really hard to come by, so that was one of the limiting factors, and you sort of had to figure out how to design your ships around what guns you could get access to in that part of the world. So yeah, they had pretty good intelligence. I don't know if they knew these numbers quite as precisely as I've got them here, but the British understood we need to fight a battle at a distance, which they did at the beginning of the battle, and that was Lawrence. And the Americans understood we got to close the gap and get right up next to him. And so you're right, this is a little bit of a historians know the ending, so we can give you more information than they had, but I think they had a pretty good sense of how to, yeah.
Part two, what happened to those British soldiers?
The ones that get captured there, oh, well, man, you don't want to be a POW in the War of 1812. It's no fun. But you get shipped back to some American camp and then maybe exchanged. It depends on the balance of forces. So the British usually tended to want to keep, for example, like French sailors, they wanted to keep in prison in Britain, and they would give back officers, because officers, as we all know, were useless. So you keep the sailors, give back the officers. The British tended to capture more French sailors, so that was so different combatants had different ideas about how much they could do. In the War of 1812, my understanding is that probably more Americans were captured than British were captured. Some of the Americans ended up in Britain and had to get, either exchanged or released when the war was over. But yeah, no fun. Yeah, sir.
So after the Perry captured all of Lake Erie, is there any interest in going after the other lakes? Or?
So Ontario remains in a stalemate basically the whole time. The race that happens on Lake Erie, on Ontario to build fleets on both sides of it from the Americans and from the British results in a stalemate. So, but that's enough from the American perspective, because if the British don't have control of Ontario, then they can't move freely in the region. So it's a denial of Ontario rather than a access to it. But this is the forces on Lake Ontario were much bigger. So Perry's little fleet here on Erie would not have done, wouldn't have moved I don't think, changed much. And also there's a giant waterfall in between that would make it difficult to get between one and the other. Yeah, sir.
Yeah, I was confused about this when I heard about it. So how is Oliver Hazard, who started the Peacedale Library and the Congregational Church, how is he related to?
I think,
Confusing your generations. Wait, you're waking.
No, it's very similar time frame.
But it's not Oliver that started the library or the Peacedale Congregational Church, it was Roland.
Roland.
Yep.
That's
Right.
Roland.
That's right.
This one started,
So I think he's born in the 1850s.
okay,
So they share a common ancestor,
yeah,
probably a guy named Oliver Hazard
yeah.
from the early 18th century. That Oliver Hazard is Oliver Hazard Perry's grandfather, because his daughter Mercy, no, maybe great-grandfather. His daughter Mercy is Oliver's grandmother. So yeah, but that's the Oliver Hazard that I think these guys probably all go back to.
Yeah.
I was worried I was going to get this question, and Sir.
What would have happened if British won the war?
Yeah.
Historically,
Okay, define winning for me.
what happened actually?
Define winning for me. I don't mean that flippantly. What does it look like for the British? How do you defeat the United States of America in 1813, 14, 15? What do you do? It's hard to figure out. They're not going to reconquer the United States. That's not possible or even desirable, right?
They stayed on in some countries for a long time.
Sure.
Ireland got independent in 1922, India got about 1947.
Yep.
So they stayed on for a long time.
But the way that they grew to conquer India and the way that they would have therefore have had to conquer the United States again were not totally different methods. So there was no version of the British by the time of the War of 1812 that could have reconquered the United States of America. So the idea that it's the Second War of Independence for us is mostly about how it makes us feel rather than actual independence. We were not going to do, but we could certainly have had to sue for peace and give up concessions that we did not want to give up, like areas to the west or maritime rights issues or things like that. So I think a victory would look like a settlement in which it wasn't status quo antebellum, but was just the British are able to extract some more concessions from us. So if they had not been defeated or turned back at Baltimore, and then if Andrew Jackson hadn't won at New Orleans, you could see that maybe happening. But it's hard to figure out exactly what the end state was for the British for a war they didn't want to fight. Does that help? You can disagree, it's fine. But I don't think they're reconquering the United States. Other questions? I worked you out. Okay, thank you. Welcome. Oh, thank you.